Movie Shapes is a better way to find, review, and share movies you love or don't. I'm Jason Scott Montoya, a lover of movies. And part of how me and Addison intersected was our love and value of movies, as well as our varying points of view on them. And last year, when we were discussing Endgame and the things we liked about it and the issues we had with it, I wrote some emails, you wrote some emails, and then you started to build a spreadsheet, and I started to work on that spreadsheet, and then we workshopped that further, and all of a sudden, Movie Shapes came out. So, what do you recollect from that time? How did that come to be? Why did you decide to start a spreadsheet from our conversation?
I remember the pain point was thinking, you'd make a fair point, and I'd read it and I'd say, okay, but I don't care about that part as much as you do. And so I thought, you know what, if I just list out for Jason the stuff I care about most, like I rank it and put the stuff I don't care about and I rank that, then Jason would say, okay, well, while I, Jason, care much about that, Addison does not. So it will not be helpful to point out to Addison, like, hey, it has great X, when Addison's mostly concerned about feature Y. Yeah. And what's interesting is, since creating it, we've been mostly interested in learning what features we like more than we are about just summarizing a movie as a good or bad movie alone. So it's made the discussions much more interesting, I think. We can talk about any movie, instead of just being like, oh, you hate it and I like it, we don't share anything. We can be like, we can say something new, like, you like it and I don't. Does that match up with our preferences? Or do we have some sort of bias here? Are we wrong about ourselves?
So to give people listening an example of our difference, so your number one cross attribute in the Movie Shapes, and we're going to jump into the attributes later, but your top is dialogue clarity. So that is your most important factor in a movie. And mine is character depth. If, and there are other factors too that we consider, but if you're just looking at through those two, obviously we're looking at the movie with completely different eyes in a way. And that's okay. We're not trying to say that one is better than the other, but it's rather to understand what it is I'm looking for and why I particularly like that thing I'm looking at. Right.
Yeah, I think even that's great, because right off the bat, we could just do this basic thought experiment. Could we imagine a movie where the dialogue is really clear, but the characters are really shallow? Or a movie where the characters are really complex, but nothing they say makes any sense? And, that would be the test is, okay, well, how do Addison and Jason feel about those films?
Yeah. And the ability to create a language, the Movie Shapes language, that allows us to discuss these things and then to slice them apart and then to reassemble them. So it's like a deconstructive, constructive exercise. And we understand that it's not as clean as it might be in the variables that we've created, but though they act as a thinking exercise to at least evaluate them in maybe a scientific way, if you would, or at a laboratory, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it, the scientific way. We're trying to take something like aesthetic and turn it into a personality test, because even personalities, right? People have been doing psychoanalysis for 120 years or so. And even then, we're still coming up with better nomenclature. And a lot of art still gets to live in a very philosophical area, but we can be really practical here. We can talk nuts and bolts. Do you like what you see? Do you like what you hear? What do you care about?
That's also a sharing mechanism. So through this exercise, I have more clarity on the types of movies you like and vice versa. And so if I'm going to recommend a movie, I can recommend it through that lens, like, hey, I think you would like this movie for this reason or that reason based on your shape. Even though my shape is different and I didn't care for that movie as much, I think you would actually like it more than I did, or vice versa.
That's a great point. I think this actually reminds me of a Martin Scorsese comment from earlier this week. He had said that he was kind of bummed that people were thinking of movies strictly as content now, and that it was really an algorithm filling out things about like genre or spectacle and things like that. And what's great about our system is that it actually says, what if we went back to curation, right? Like where a person would still decide what is an objectively good movie, but then they could still match you with that curated film that's best for you. There's not enough time in the day to watch every good movie.
So for me, when I think about like general systems like IMDb or Rotten Tomatoes or even Netflix, to a lesser degree. They say a movie is good or not, and you have the critics and the users. But there's a limitation in my mind. It feels like that's a reactive assessment of whether a movie is good, and it's too broad in its numbers. And I think what we're trying to do is say, who are you, and then create a system that sort of snipers into you and your preferences, as opposed to this generic thing that, the Rotten Tomato score, perhaps it's a variable to consider, and we don't necessarily we're not trying to replace that, but it's just so broad and generic that it's a difficult tool for people that love movies. Maybe for casual people, it's a better tool. Maybe that's the difference.
That's true, because ultimately there are going to be some people who don't want to look under the hood this much. And in that way, a lot of this can eventually be automated, right? Like you click thumbs up on a Netflix movie, it's going to be like, I kind of bet you liked these elements.
Yeah.
Thinking like Pandora Music, or when you're using Apple Music, it kind of starts to figure out what you like. The crazy thing is, a lot of movies, the way they've broken it down is based on only a very limited set of data, because they're using the things that they already know about movies, the cast. So, for example, they're like, oh, people like Will Smith cop movies and fantasy movies, so they made Bright. Bright, and it flopped. They're like, how could this happen? People who loved Lord of the Rings and Bad Boys didn't like Bright. Yeah. There's a little bit more to it than that. We love Lord of the Rings for different reasons than we love Bad Boys, and
another example, I recently watched The Rhythm Section, which is a kind of a spy thriller, which got brutal reviews on Rotten Tomatoes and elsewhere, but I liked it. And a lot of the reviews said it wasn't anything new, it wasn't novel. I mean, that's one of our attributes, is novelty. But I have a low novelty score, so I don't necessarily need a movie to be new or different. I just want it to be good in the sense of what I think is good. And I saw the performance, the character, and the visuals as the top three movie values, and then the top three audience preferences: believability, clarity, and impact. So, but if you have a high novelty need, then you wouldn't have liked that movie. And so, that's an example of that playing out.
That's a good example. I watched a foreign film. It was okay. It was called Border. It's Swedish, and it is a fantasy thriller film. And it has to do some similarities to a project I'm working on. But it really didn't share almost any of my top attributes, just because it was mostly about setting and novelty. Novelty and setting are both very low attributes on mine. So while I was like, okay, I'm going to get outside my comfort zone and appreciate what's good in this, it just didn't grab me. It didn't, put tears in my eyes or anything. The way I would expect other, films with more of the things I care about, like dialogue, clarity, and story, those kinds of things.
And I think we're tapping into something that I think does happen organically, which is friend referral, movie referrals from friends. So I think to some degree, we tend to have friends in circles that share certain of values. I think certain critics you might follow along either on Twitter or other places, and the movies they suggest, you're like, oh yeah, that's good. And there's something happening there, but it's organic, formalized. And I think what we're trying to do is go, what's happening there? And could we sort of facilitate that in an intentional way versus it just being an accident for certain people that stumble upon it?
Yeah, to an extent, we're going to eliminate some of the arguments that are happening, because when people say certain things, a lot of times they're using a word that has multiple meanings, right? Mm-hmm. So that is the challenge. They'll say that movie has no depth, and it might actually have depth in 4 out of 7 categories, but that person was meaning depth in 3 specific areas. I don't want to take the wind out of the sails of people who love to argue.
Because there's a difference between character depth, story depth, visual depth, like all of those, and that's what we're trying to account for, is those variants.
Yeah, because there will be somebody who saw the other spot where there was depth, and they'll be like, what are you talking about? Are you even watching the same movie? Yeah. But the word depth really applies to a lot of different features. So
yeah. And the system allows us to kind of look at it at a high level and maybe just talk about depth. But then if you get that in that disagreement, then you can slice it in. And I think generally speaking, we can generally agree on the strengths or the top, the most worthwhile elements of a movie. I think we can have general agreement on those. When there is, it's usually a definition, like, well, how are you looking at it and within what layer? But that gives us a tool to actually work through that versus just both people just kind of being stuck. But I think like me and you would maybe look at a Snyder, a Zack Snyder type movie and go, visual is going to be a high priority element for his movies. That's sort of a trademark of his. And if depending on how the other factors tie in, might determine whether or not that's something you want or not. So even though we might evaluate the movie differently, we can generally agree that visual is one of the strong elements of it.